Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallim ala rasulih al-Kareem. Amma ba'd. I hope everyone is doing well. And our lecture 4 is now focusing in on the life of Imam Abu Hanifa, or briefly we're going to look at the life of Hammad Abi Sulaiman, then Imam Abu Hanifa, and then move on to his two companions, Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. So once we've kind of highlighted these figures and even briefly looked at the two other companions of Imam Abu Hanifa, which is Imam Zufr ibn Hudayl and Imam Hassan bin Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i, then we can actually have a good base to work off, because these are our main key figures when it comes to the Hanafi madhab. Everyone else that comes after, of course, is reliant upon these key figures. So the figures that we looked at last lesson, which is Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, the ashab of Abdullah Mas'ud and Abdullah Mas'ud radiyallahu anhum, they are you can say where Imam Abu Hanifa takes his knowledge from. And then you have the person of Imam Abu Hanifa himself, and then you have his companions, and who are pivotal in the spreading of his madhab, right? In the spreading of his madhab. So once we kind of get these figures and understand them, then we can start to move on to some of the key features of the Hanafi madhab that kind of distinguishes it from the other madhahib. And then once we start to look at some of the case studies, it will start to make much more easy. It will be easier for us to make sense of how the madhab develops, because once you know the key figures and you have a basic chronology, it becomes easier for us to navigate and to see where a position originated from, why it originated from them. I'll give you one quick example just as an introduction to we're talking about this, is that if someone turns up and says, where did the mas'ala or the case of the beard come from? So what we can do with chronology is that we can go look at a discussion and say, right, Imam so-and-so said this, Imam so-and-so said this, and we can put them into chronology, and then we can start to fixate and say, okay, this is the person who said that the beard is wajib. Is that Imam Abu Hanifa? Is it Sahibain? Is an early person in the madhab? Okay, that's that. What about a fist length being wajib? Who was the first to say that? Can that be extrapolated from the position of Abu Hanifa? Is it indirectly inferred or not? So once you get an understanding of the core foundation of who the people are, and then we'll look into the books and the taqsim al-masail, when you start to adopt and approach the madhab or read studies of the madhab, it becomes far more easier to untangle, inshallah. So what we're going to do before we move on to the life and times of Abu Hanifa and briefly about his Sheikh Hammad Abi Sulaiman, our first segment, it will be looking at a brief introduction into masadir, which are our sources, because what distinguishes between I would say a lay reader or even a informed reader and a bahith, a researcher, is the ability to distinguish between sources. Because a simple way to kind of formulate this is that if I read a newspaper article, and the newspaper article is telling me about crime in UK or London or something more specific, and I'm reading about this and they're saying a study has shown this, a study has shown this, Professor so-and-so said this, as a lay reader who doesn't have the ability to distinguish between the sources, all of that information, even though I can understand the English, I can understand the language, right? I'm not struggling with the language of it, but for me to actually understand or differentiate between the sources, to say, right, is that a good source? Is that a primary source? Is that a secondary source? How did this study, how did they do it? Who is this professor? What university is that? And so on and so forth. That was what a researcher or a critical reader can do. So similarly, when we're doing a biography of a figure like Imam Abu Hanifa, and not just him, any historical figure, right? Any historical figure, it's incumbent upon us to distinguish between what we're going to call masadir asliya, which are original sources, right? Or we can call primary sources, and then we have secondary sources. Primary sources, secondary sources. Now, a primary source, okay, in our when you're using terms like history, or so when you're doing history, or when you're doing specifically Islamic history, or using Islamic sources, a primary source is defined by one which has isnad. When it comes to history, right, it's something that has isnad. So a person cites from their authority back to the person or information or report that they are narrating. That will be referred to as a primary source. So for example, if I get a book like the Tarikh Baghdad of Khatib al-Baghdadi, so Khatib, every incident he mentions or things he mentions about people has an isnad. So the report in Tarikh Baghdad or Khatib is going to be a primary source. A primary source then doesn't necessarily can have levels to it. So if you have a primary source, so let's say Khatib, his source of information is the Tarikh Kabir of Imam Bukhari. So he brings his sanad back to Imam Bukhari's Tarikh Kabir, who has his sanad going back to whatever incident. There, even though Khatib is a primary source because he brings his isnad, but we have access to the earlier primary source. In that case, there's Imam Bukhari's Tarikh Kabir. Therefore, we would ideally start our citation from Tarikh Kabir and then Khatib Baghdadi's source. So both are primary, but in that specific incident, Tarikh Baghdad will become secondary. So if someone just cites Tarikh Baghdad and doesn't cite Tarikh Kabir Imam Bukhari, there will be what is called a khalal, a shortcoming in one citation. Because someone would say that there is the earlier source that he's citing from is available to us, that's what you should be ideally citing. Okay? And the reason why they can actually, we don't have time, but there's a lot to talk about it. But anyway, on the other side, right, you have the discussion of, so that's what is called, we actually refer to Arabic as being musnad text. Musnad meaning they have a standing. Musnad has different connotations depending on what field or what context you're using it in. But in this context, a musnad means one with isnad. So in a simplistic term, that will be our primary source. Our secondary source will be the non-musnad text, those that do not have asanid. So these will be later sources that usually cite from these earlier sources, right? So for example, if we're looking at, to make it very simple, let's say I write a book on history, the life and times of Imam al-Tahawi. So when I look at the life and times of Imam al-Tahawi, I will then look at the books accessible to me, right? I'll look at the books accessible to me, and then I will cite from them. My book now will not be a primary source on the life of Imam al-Tahawi, rather that will be a secondary source. But what happens is that in many instances, a secondary source, which basically is cited from earlier books, so a secondary source, it doesn't necessarily have to bring its isnad. So he's just saying, Fulan said this in regarding this person, he died this year, whatever, right? Even though that's a secondary source, there are instances where the secondary source can become primary. How is that? Is when the primary source is no longer accessible. So this happens a lot with the likes of people like Imam al-Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar, where they would write a biography of a scholar like Imam al-Tahawi, for example, and they will say, Fulan said this, Fulan said this. So now, their sources are not necessarily going to be with isnad. But because they are citing from primary sources, and we don't have access to a lot of those sources, and because of the rank of the likes of Dhahabi, then the Tarikh Islam, Sirah Alam Nubala, Tadhkiratul Huffaz, Mizan al-I'tidal, these are Dhahabi's books, right? Or Lisan al-Mizan, right? Ad-Durr al-Kamila, which is actually not going to be for Tahawi, right? Or Al-Isaba, whatever we're talking about, right? In that instance, the secondary source will become primary. Why? Because we don't have access to the primary source that they have access to. Okay? So it's very important that our sources in front of us, we make that division. So the ideal best source would be the earliest source with isnad. Now, of course, the later you go in Islamic history, you find autobiographies, and then that becomes another. That becomes, the strongest insight into the life and times of a given scholar. You have students writing biographies, etc. So in the earliest time periods, so Shafi'i, Ahmed, Malik, Abu Hanifa, Awza'i, Sufyan Thawri, these imams, they don't have autobiographies, nor do you have students writing elaborate biographies of them, but you do have reports about them, and they later on become collected into books, and those collected initial books will be with isnad. That will be a primary source, and then you have later scholars who would cite from those, and they will become secondary sources. But the secondary sources may be cited from primary sources that we don't have access to, so the secondary source becomes primary. Okay, hopefully that's not too confusing, right? But that's something which is very important for anyone doing, especially when we're doing the type of studies that we're doing here, to allow something to be considered as for someone to do history properly, right? This basic division is very important. Now, there's a lot of nuance I've missed here, right? There's a lot of nuance I've missed here deliberately because we don't have time to delve so deep into it. But as you will see in our next segment, when we look at the masadir, the sources for the life of Imam Abu Hanifa, you will see that it becomes far more easier. You see practically the implications that come from the distinction between primary and secondary sources, and the confusion that can come about when someone does not adopt this methodology soundly, right? Doesn't adopt this methodology soundly, because information which is clearly later, right? Information which is clearly later is cited as being true, right? Now, in most instances, it doesn't really matter. Right, so that's why a lot of the times the critical method is not applied to these kind of information, because, for example, if there is a narration which has Imam Malik, for example, saying that he would read the Tahajjud every night, or he will do X, Y, and Z ibadah, and it only shows there's no implication beyond the fact of praise of Imam Malik, there's no reason for a lot of the scholars to become super critical about their isnad or rendering the information accurate or inaccurate, because there's no implications to that information. In contrast to that, when there's information which has some implication, so let's say they have them doing something which has a fiqh connotation or aqidah connotation, or is some sort of ibadah which suggests that they are approving of a certain act of worship, etc., then our knowledge of all of this becomes very important, right? So we can differentiate between an accurate information and inaccurate information. So that's our first segment, just to talk about the distinction between masadir asliya and masadir far'iyya, primary sources and secondary sources. In our next segment, we will look at the life of, let's say, the masadir for the life of Abu Hanifa, and in our last segment of this lesson, inshallah, we'll be looking at the life of actually Abu Hanifa, and just before that we'll briefly look in the life of Hammad Abi Sulaiman, inshallah. Okay, so this allows us to move on to our second segment, which is the sources for the life of Imam Abu Hanifa. So one aspect, or one the sources for the life of any of the early figures from the Salaf, right? So the first 300-400 years of the Imams are relatively the same. So you can go to your earlier sources, such as, like I said, the Tarikh Kabir Imam Bukhari, the Jarh wa Ta'deel of Abu Hatim al-Razi, Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi. So these are books of Rijal, and you'll find the Tabaqat Ibn Sa'id, which is a bit more earlier, Tarikh Baghdad, right, and so on and so forth. And then you have the great books written during the Mamluk era, like the Siyar A'lam al-Nubala of Dhahabi, and so on and so forth. So these are large works where you'll find entries of these individual figures therein. So we're not going to mention those masadir. Those masadir are generic, and you can always refer back to them. If we had time, we could go through, but our purpose is to kind of fixate upon Imam Abu Hanifa specifically. In Urdu, there's a paper written. So if anyone knows Urdu, you can find this paper. It's called Imam Abu Hanifa ke Manaqib par likhi gayi kitabein. Ek ta'aruf. So this translates as the books of virtue written. So the books on the life, translate for now, life of Imam Abu Hanifa. An introduction by Maulana Ubaidullah Akhtar Rahmani. and he basically goes through the literature of manaqib. So manaqib is a term which is used, which basically lists the virtues of a given individual, but you more or less have the life of that person highlighted there. So you have the manaqib of Imam Shafi'i, written by Imam Bayhaqi. You got the manaqib of Ahmed, written by numerous scholars, Ibn al-Jawzi being one of them, and so on and so forth. And so you have these books of manaqib. So likewise, manaqib we can translate, although it's not the accurate translation, but for the purpose of meaning, we say these are the biographies written about Imam Hanifa, and these will be positive biographies. The other sources I mentioned, they would have, like the Tarikh Baghdad is a good example, which has two sections. One is praise of Imam Hanifa, and then you have criticism of Imam Hanifa. We will talk about that inshallah later on. I think next lesson it works out to be, we'll look at that, of why that was the case, or why Imam Hanifa had these disparaging remarks. So from the so you have these early primary sources which talk about the life of Imam Hanifa, can be divided into two categories. So when we spoke about primary sources, but the primary sources can be divided into two categories. You have the sources which are available and sources which are lost, right? So you have books which are available and books which are lost. So the books which are available, we'll talk about. The books that are lost are some of the earlier sources. So what happens is that a lot of the later sources, they cite from these earlier, now no longer available sources. That makes sense, right? So for example, as you would learn in, I believe in the Usul al-Fiqh lesson, that the earliest book we have of Usul in the Hanafi madhab is by Abu Bakr Jassas Razi, Al-Fusul fil Usul. We have a small work of Qarhi, but the actual Usul work we have Abu Bakr Jassas, Al-Fusul fil Usul. In Al-Fusul fil Usul, Jassas cites excessively from Isa ibn Aban, who's a student of Imam Muhammad, his book, which is called Al-Hujj al-Saghir, which is on the way a faqih is meant to engage with the sunnah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So that original source is no longer available, but Jassas cites from it, right? Jassas cites from it. So similarly, we have, when it comes to the masadir of Imam Hanifa, we have early sources which are no longer available to us, and then we have earlier sources which are available. So we divide those. So this is the earliest individual we can find that has a biography of Imam Hanifa dedicated, is cited by Ubayd Akhtar as being Abu Yahya Zakaria ibn Yahya, who died in the year 298. So he goes, Abu Hanifa is not extant, but Haji Khalifa, he cites the work. So this book is no longer available, but Haji Khalifa, the author of Kashf al-Dhunun, he writes this this book as being one of the earliest works on Imam Abu Hanifa. The second famous individual to dedicate a biography of Imam Abu Hanifa is Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Salt ibn Mughallis al-Himmani, who died in the year 308 Hijri, also known as Ahmed ibn Atiyya. He is said to have gathered a very large book on the biography and virtues of Abu Hanifa. His book is not available, but has been quoted from later sources. Hence, at least significant portions are preserved. When it's quoted from later sources, it's hard to know if the whole book has been preserved or only parts of it. Right? So when you have someone citing from it, it's hard to know how much they've actually cited from that. I would presume that the bulk of it has been cited, but it's you can't know for sure. But at least significant portions have been preserved of the book. Major problems is that Ibn Salt has seriously been criticized and accused of lying by hadith scholars. So this is something which we will also touch upon, is that some of these early figures, when you put them under the microscope of jarh wa ta'deel of the muhaddithun, they have severe criticism against them. This is one person, Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Salt, as being an example. You have Muhammad al-Shuja' al-Thalji, who's a student of Hasan bin Ziyad. Again, severe criticism against him. We also, of course, had Abu Hanifa himself with criticism by the muhaddithin. So how one deals with that is another discussion or another debate. But there is reason to doubt the narrations of Ahmed ibn Salt. But he is a early source, but his work is no longer available. One of the people who actually cites from Ahmed ibn Salt is from an early book, which is a primary source of the life of Abu Hanifa, is As-Saymuri's Akhbaru Abi Hanifa wa Ashabihi. right? Akhbar Abi Hanifa Ashabi by Imam al-Saymari. And if you go to his work, you'll see him cite from Ahmad Muhammad ibn Mughallis in various places. Right, so that shows that even though the primary sources, the sanad may have to be looked into to see how reliable they are. There's a paper in English which inshallah will be made accessible, which is known as the title is Ahmad ibn Salt and his biography of Abu Hanifa by Eric Dickinson from Yale University. This is a good paper to read about Ahmad ibn Salt and some of the problems with him and his biography. Alright, when Ubayd Akhtar tries to defend Ibn Salt, I do have reservations about that. Another early scholar to write a biography of Imam Abu Hanifa which is not available is Imam al-Tahawi. Right? So Imam Tahawi, contrary to Ahmad ibn Salt, he's an agreed upon authority by everyone. So when it comes to his books and hadith, no one questions the reliability of Imam Tahawi as a transmitter of narrations. So he has a biography. Likewise, his book is not extant, but later sources like the Manaqib Abu Hanifa by Fadail Abu Hanifa Ibn Abi Awwam cites from Imam Tahawi, which means that we have a significant portion, or at least a significant portion of his work available, and so you can actually sift through and see what Tahawi's narrations were and kind of get a feel of what it is. So you can go back to Fadail Abu Hanifa and you have narrations in which this is mentioned. So for example, you have the narration in Fadail Abu Hanifa where Imam Abu Hanifa says لا ينبغي للرجل يحدث من الحديث إلا ما يحفظه من يوم سمعه إلى يوم يحدث به. It's not allowed for a person to narrate a hadith except that from the day he heard it, he's memorized it continuously until the day he narrates it. If you look at the sanad from Ibn Abi Awam's Fadail Abu Hanifa, you see he says حدثني أحمد بن محمد بن سلامة, and Ahmad Muhammad Salama is the name of Imam al-Tahawi. So this most likely is a citation from the book of Imam al-Tahawi by his sanad back to the book. Another work, you have Ali ibn Ka's, Ali Muhammad al-Nakha'i Ibn Ka's, who died in 324 Hijri. Ibn Ka's was deemed as a trustworthy narrator, which would make his work an important source. Again, the book is not available, but we have citations from in Khatib Baghdad Tarikh and As-Saymari's Akhbar Abi Hanifa. Right. So what we can say is that from the early available sources, then, right, it will be three major works. Right, three major works. One will be the Fadail Abi Hanifa Ibn Abi Awwam, right, who died debatable around 335 Hijri, right, and this has been published and available. So this is an early work with sanad that mentions the life and times of Imam Abu Hanifa, but they mention in narration, so it's not going to be like a biography the way you view it. It'll be information as you found in narrations. And then you have the Akhbar Abi Hanifa wa Ashabihi by As-Saymari. As-Saymari's Akhbar Abi Hanifa wa Ashabihi has more problematic narrations because he relies a lot on Ahmad ibn Salt. Whereas Ibn Abi Awam's Fadail Abi Hanifa is considered more reliable because he's more particular in who he narrates from. And the third source will be the Tarikh Baghdad of Khatib Baghdadi. But the Tarikh Baghdad of Khatib Baghdadi has a major problem, and the problem is that he has a section in which he praises Imam Abu Hanifa, but he has a lot of authentic reports that he has gathered. But then you have the second section which he mentions a lot of disparaging remarks about Imam Abu Hanifa, which we will come back to and explain with some universals to understand how to approach that. But that first half is considered as a very important source, original source for the life of Abu Hanifa, even though it's part of a larger book. It's not dedicated to him, but the largest extent entry in Tarikh Baghdad is the biography of Imam Abu Hanifa. Another source which has been published recently, which is called Kashf al-Athar al-Sharifa fi Manaqib Imam Abu Hanifa by Abu Abdullah al-Harithi, right, who died in 340 Hijri, I believe. Although it's two bulky volumes, the individual Harithi is being severely criticized with muhaddithin, and I believe accurately so. So even though it's a large book, reliance upon it, one has to have a great level of skepticism, right? And As-Saymari's Akhbar Abi Hanifa Ashabihi, he died in 436 Hijri, so one has to keep in mind of that. A bit more of a later source now, which is Ibn Abdul Bar's Al-Intiqa fi Fadail al-A'immat al-Thalath al-Fuqaha which is a book on the manaqib of the three Imams, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Abu Hanifa. This is also considered as a very important source in which he brings with isnad information about the life and times of Imam Abu Hanifa. This was published by Sheikh Abdul Fattah, Imam al-Kawthari, and thereafter published again by Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. This is considered across the board as a reliable source for the life and times of Imam Abu Hanifa. So these are what we will call primary sources. There's one other source which again is a bit later, does have isnad but are quite long isnad and requires a bit more analysis, is the Manaqib Abu Hanifa by Muwafiq al-Makki. Muwafiq al-Makki dies in 568 Hijri. And he's using a lot of his earlier sources are no longer accessible to us, but I've yet to see a thorough study on this masadir. After that, the other books that we have, like the Khiratul Hisan of Ibn Hajj al-Haytami, what's it called, Imam al-Suyuti's book, which is not coming to my mind, or Imam Abu Hanifa's entry in the Tahdhib al-Tahdhib or Tahdhib al-Kamal, or Imam al-Dhahabi's Manaqib Hanifa wa Ashabihi, right, wa Sahibihi. These kind of works, right, these will all be considered as being, generally speaking, secondary sources. Most of the information will come in the sources that I've already mentioned to you before. So that's the divide of primary and secondary, right? It's quite brief, but hopefully that gives us a bit of a better understanding of the various books written on the life and times of Imam Abu Hanifa. And now we can move on to, inshallah, a bit about Imam Abu Hanifa's Sheikh Hamad bin Sulaiman and Imam Abu Hanifa. So now that we've clarified the sources of the idea of primary and secondary sources, and we also looked at briefly the primary and secondary sources when it comes to the life of Abu Hanifa, it makes sense now that we can move on to the life of Imam Abu Hanifa and look into it. So what I'll be giving to you guys as well, inshallah, and this is what we're kind of using for the biography of Abu Hanifa, is the book Al-Madhhab al-Hanafi by Ahmed Naqib. Al-Madhhab al-Hanafi by Ahmed Naqib. I'll talk more about this book, inshallah, in the coming few lectures. From the contemporary works of the biographies of Abu Hanifa, you have in English Shaykh Akram Nadwi's book on the life of Abu Hanifa. You also have the four Imams, the biography of them by Abu Zahra, Sheikh Abu Zahra, and then you also have G.F. Haddad's book. I think it's called The Four Imams in Their Schools. Right, so these are places where, although that book has tries to show the Aqidah and stuff, it's more of a refutation of Salafis as well. The G.F. Haddad's work. But what we are interested in is just a basic background to the life of Abu Hanifa, and now that we can know primary and secondary source, it will be easier for us to kind of navigate through them, inshallah. So the first thing to look at is, as we do with any biography, is his name, birth, death date, and his seeking knowledge. So his name is Nu'man ibn Thabit al-Kufi. There's a longer name, as a debate about his origin, but we're not going to go into that because of the lack of time, but you can read into that, inshallah, those sources I mentioned to you. He was born in the year 80 Hijri. He was born in the year 80 Hijri. There are some narrations which suggest an earlier date. The late Imam Zahid al-Kawthari, we mentioned him before, he's argued for an earlier date of the birthday of Imam Abu Hanifa. I've written a small article on this online, you can check up about the birthday of Imam Abu Hanifa, and I argue that the most accurate and authentic dating for the birthday is the 80 Hijri. The benefit of having an earlier date is that there are some narrations which suggest that Imam Abu Hanifa narrated from Sahaba. The earlier the date of his birth, the more likelihood of him narrating from Sahaba is there, so that's why some will try to argue for an earlier date. But what the most authentic sources have demonstrated to us or shown to us, that he was born in the year 80 Hijri in Kufa, and most of his life he stayed in Kufa, and he died in the year 150 at the age of 70, right, in Baghdad. He passed away in Baghdad 150. The year that Imam Abu Hanifa passed away is the year that Imam Shafi'i was born. It has been said that the day that Imam Abu Hanifa was born was the day that Imam Hanifa passed away was the day that Imam Shafi'i was born. That is not established, right? Could have happened, but it's the year was the same. And Imam Abu Hanifa at a young age, he was a businessman, and then he came under the guidance of Imam al-Sha'bi, who noticed in him the knowledge, or you can say the intelligence, and so he encouraged him to go and seek knowledge. This is mentioned in the Manaqib Abu Hanifa of Muwaffaq al-Makki. I told you it's a bit of a later source, but you find this story there. Again, as I mentioned before, a lot of this information, because there's nothing in it which suggests any negativity or any profound implication, we just kind of the critical nature of applying to the sources has not really been applied. So once you do it, you're more than welcome. But this is mentioned in Muwaffaq al-Makki, this incident that he was the one that kind of encouraged him. What we do know is that when he started seeking knowledge, he excelled in it from his contemporaries. Kufa at that time, as we highlighted before, was a hub for knowledge, and so therefore its masajid, they were full with scholars teaching, etc. And so therefore Imam Hanifa he did not see it necessary to travel extensively. So the idea of rihla, of traveling extensively, Imam Abu Hanifa did not seek the need of doing so because of the fact of how many scholars there were in Kufa. There's some wisdom in that. That's a lot of the times we do not appreciate the scholarship that is around us, so we want to go and, they say the grass is greener at the side, so we want to travel far and wide to acquire something they could have acquired more closer to home. So Imam Abu Hanifa saw the great scholars around him, so that kind of he did not spend too much time traveling. He spent most of his time in Kufa learning from the scholars that were there. Rather, Muwaffaq al-Makki has a narration in which he's asked that where did you get this knowledge from, and he says that I was in a place which was the treasure of knowledge, so I sat with these people until I وَلَزِمْتُ فَقِيهِ مِنْ فُقَهَائِهِمْ, and I attached myself to one of their jurists. His name was Hammad bin Abi Sulaiman, فَانْتَفَعْتُ بِهِ, and I benefited a lot from him. And it also has been said in some narrations that he engaged in ilmul kalam. Right, he engaged in ilmul kalam before he learned fiqh. Numerous narrations to this effect have come, and there's been a debate whether this is authentic or not, because the idea of ilmul kalam in that period was not known as a science. So some scholars have chosen to deny this and say it's not true, some historians, because there was no such thing as ilmul kalam at that time. But if we were to just understand the term ilmul kalam being used anachronistically by saying that ilmul kalam refers to the engagement in debate with opponents rather than ilmul kalam being a formulated science, right? So he would engage in debating other groups and bahth and munadara, and then he chose to go to the route of fiqh. That would mean that type of ilmul kalam is in a more linguistic sense, he engaged with debate, discussion. That would then make sense, and there'd be no reason to deny that as being historically untrue because of the absence of ilmul kalam. But if you're saying ilmul kalam is a science, then that would be very difficult to justify. And there are narrations to their own effect of why Imam Abu Hanifa chose to move away from ilmul kalam and move into the field of fiqh. So what we do know is that he sat in the gatherings of Hammad bin Abi Sulaiman, and Hammad bin Abi Sulaiman was from the students of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. He narrated extensively for Ibrahim al-Nakha'i and was a jurist of his own right. Again, he was not proficient in the transmission of hadith, and you'll see this as a quality of a number of jurists that excelled in fiqh, is that they would not necessarily have the biggest career in the field of transmitting hadith, because they chose fiqh al-hadith rather than riwayat al-hadith. So Hammad Sulaiman was not known as being a proficient transmitter of hadith, prophetic hadith, but when it comes to fiqh, he was considered the imam of his time, and so Imam Abu Hanifa sat with him and learned from him until he passed away. Now, alongside Hammad bin Sulaiman, we also know that he took from the likes of Atta bin Abi Rabah, and rather actually praised Atta's fiqh, alongside, it's been said, 3,000 some scholars. And also this figure that has been given, 3,000 or 4,000 scholars that Imam Abu Hanifa took from, although it does seem to be mubalagha, which is exaggeration, but it doesn't have to be if you understand what being a teacher is. So if a teacher is someone that you take a hadith from or some sort of ilm from, if that is technically a teacher, and at that time there's not book based the way it is today, where every day you may be going around learning from someone, learning a hadith from someone, hearing this, in that sense, and then going for Hajj, right, going for Umrah, spending 4 or 5 months there, various scholars come and learning from separate people. So then to have such a large number as teachers, right, teachers in the loose sense, or teachers in the linguistic sense, or someone who's taught you something, wouldn't be that off, right? It would actually make a lot of sense. So by the age, once Hammad ibn Sulaiman passes away in the year 120, I believe, around that time period, Imam Abu Hanifa takes over his majlis. Imam Abu Hanifa takes over his majlis, and then he begins to teach, and he starts to get his own ashab, his own companions, and he gains a lot of proficiency because of this. And there's a number of narrations which actually talk about Imam Abu Hanifa's when he sat to take over the seat of Hammad bin Sulaiman. That was done because of the indication of Hammad himself by putting him in the front of his class. But there's a lot of narrations which show how Imam Abu Hanifa taught. And this is something that we'll be looking at, inshallah, right, in a small segment of the method of Imam Abu Hanifa's teaching, and what I believe is a significant reason for the spread of the Hanafi madhab, right? So it wasn't just political, right? The political aspect is there, as we'll talk about Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, but the reasons or the ways in which Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad became such great jurists and were chosen for this task or wrote these great books, Imam Abu Hanifa has a direct impact on that, and so we cannot belittle that impact. All right. So from his famous students, then we have, of course, Imam Zufar, right? Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, Imam Hassan bin Ziyad. These are the 4 names that everyone should be aware of, because the bulk of Hanafi fiqh, when they talk about opinions, come back to these 4. Rather, it comes back to Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, right? And then you can say Imam Zufar, and then you have Imam Hassan bin Ziyad. These are the 4 major figures that everyone should be aware of, and whose life we'll be looking at in a bit more detail, inshallah. With that, because of course we only have small segments to look at the life of Abu Hanifa, so I would advise people to refer back to the English sources I mentioned, and a bit more detail you can refer to Ahmed Naqib's Al-Madhab Al-Hanafi, which hopefully should be made accessible to you guys, inshallah. With that said, we can conclude our last the lesson 4 that we just covered, and there's 3 main things that we looked at in these lessons. Number 1 was the distinction between primary and secondary sources and some of the nuance surrounding that, and then we have the distinction between the masadir, the source of the life of Abu Hanifa, and we differentiate between the primary and secondary sources. And then number 3, you have the life and times of Imam Abu Hanifa that we looked at very, very briefly. His birth date was born in the year 80, the debate around that, and the more accurate date being 80. The fact that his teachers, and the most famous teacher is Hammad bin Sulaiman, who he learnt with, sat in his majlis until he passed away, and then he took over his majlis. He's taught for 30 years, and he produced new famous students such as Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, Imam Zufar, Imam Hassan bin Ziyad, and a whole host of other scholars. There's a very famous narration about the 40 in the majlis of Imam Hanifa that were there. And then he passes away in the year 150 Hijri, and after him the madhab develops. Now there are some questions which are lingering still, which I believe we're going to check up my timetable, the course outline, to see if we have time for that, which is to do with the books that Imam Abu Hanifa wrote, or did he write any books, and if they are, how accurate, authentic are they attributed back to Imam Abu Hanifa. We soon look at the life and times of his main students, at least the sources, so you can access them and briefly talk about it in class, and then the major works that kind of formulate the initial stage of the Hanafi madhab, and then we're going to look at the Taqsim al-Masail of Zahiri wa Nawadir and Fatawa Mashayikh, inshaAllah. With that, we'll conclude our 4th lesson, and we'll continue with some of these topics in next lesson, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.